Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. Today's episode is about economic inequality. Now, before you turn the dial, I know what you're thinking. Jonathan, I know that there is economic inequality. No need to do a whole podcast episode about it. Okay, fair enough. But this isn't your typical social work lecture where we talk about poverty rates, argue about how we define poverty, or even talk about the benefits of social programs like earned income tax credit, Social Security, or supplemental nutritional assistance programs that move groups of people from below the poverty line to above the poverty line. I'm not even going to quote Ethical Standard 601 of the NASW Code of Ethics that says that social workers should advocate for living conditions conducive to the fulfillment of basic human needs. Because today's podcast is about economic inequality, not income inequality. I'll say that again. Economic inequality is not the same as income inequality, and fulfilling basic human needs isn't enough. And to unpack this idea, I spoke with Dr. David Williams, professor of political science at DePaul University and author of the 2024 book, The Greatest of All Plagues: How Economic Inequality Shaped Political Thought from Plato to Marx. Now, why talk with a political scientist about a bunch of dead philosophers? Well, social work is an inherently interdisciplinary profession. Every day we put into practice the insights from the fields of biology, psychology, sociology, the biopsychosocial, ring a bell, and even politics and economics. But the relationship between social work and the political philosophy Dr. Williams is writing about, well, it's not so clear. And don't tell David, but I'm not even sure that I know what political philosophy is. But that doesn't stop me from being excited about today's conversation. In his book, Dr. Williams argues that the great Western political thinkers have persistently warned against the dangers of economic inequality. For example, he tells us that 2,300 years ago, Plato pointed out that economic inequality created a divided society, which led to conflict and instability. And Plato wasn't just philosophizing. He was grappling with something that he was dealing with during his lifetime. And today, with the greatest wealth gap in a century, we see how rising economic inequality correlates with the growth of authoritarian populism, social distrust, and political instability. So, today's conversation will provide you with a deeper understanding of the historical roots of economic inequality, insights into the ethical, social, and political implications of economic disparities, exposure to various philosophical arguments and proposed solutions related to inequality, and a framework for connecting historical thought to contemporary discussions on wealth, poverty, and social justice. Interested? I hope so. Now, a few words about today's episode. This is a live interview that I did with David for his book launch on September 3rd, 2024, in front of a standing room only crowd at Squeezebox, a groovy used book and record store in Evanston, Illinois. In the introduction, you'll hear me refer to myself as the drummer in the Jazz Dads, which is the jazz group that David and I have played in since January of 2023. Here's a little clip from a recent gig. I also wanted to let you know that I went old school with the recording. I set up a mic and a PA and then put my trusty Zoom H2 digital recorder in front of the speaker. That's right. No line in, no mixing board. I channeled my inner 10-year-old who would take my Fisher-Price tape recorder and place it next to the hi-fi speaker. The good news is that the sound quality is much better today than it was in the 1970s. Finally, about 27 minutes into the interview, we open it up for questions. Now, I'm keeping the Q&A in the episode because there are a lot of thoughtful questions and answers. The audience did not have a microphone, so you'll hear silence or faint talking during the questions. But during the interview, I summarized most of the questions before handing the mic over to David, in part because I knew that I would be publishing this as a podcast episode. So if you hear silence, that's probably what's going on. And the episode ends very sweetly with David wishing his wife happy birthday. And now, without further ado, on to episode 140 of the Social Work Podcast, The Greatest of All Plagues, Dr. David Williams on economic inequality. Well, so welcome, everybody. I'm Jonathan Singer. I'm a professor of social work at Loyola University, or probably better known as the drummer in the Jazz Dads. And it is my pleasure to interview Dr. David Williams about his new book, and today's publication day, right? It is. Today is the day. Yeah, woohoo! The Greatest of All Plagues, How Economic Inequality Shaped Political Thought from Plato to Marx. So David's a professor at DePaul, and he has one other book, Rousseau's Platonic Enlightenment, two other books. And I did not prepare for this. And Rousseau's Social Contract and Introduction. Please, big round of applause for David. And I also have a podcast, so I'm going to be recording this in case this works out for the podcast. Now, that's what that is right over there, the little microphone, because it reminds me of my childhood when I would go up to the speaker with my tape player and try and record things off the radio. So, all right. So, David, what is economic inequality, and how did you get interested in writing about inequality?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. I haven't done one of these before, even though this is my third book. But since I've been working on this book for much longer than it took me to write my dissertation, I thought it was worth taking a night to celebrate with friends. So thank you, all of you, for coming, which makes this a really special evening for me. So your question is, what is economic inequality? And I'm going to paraphrase my own book. Economic inequality is distinguished from other forms of inequality that will be familiar in various degrees to people here. There's inequality of race and class. We'll talk about class, ethnicity, religion, gender, lots of forms of inequality. And all of these topics are surely worthy of books just as much as this one. But I did narrow it down to this one form of inequality, which I call economic inequality, which obviously involves questions of wealth and poverty. But I also want to narrow this definition. I worked to narrow this definition a little bit in the book as well. I'm distinguishing what economists sometimes call wealth inequality from income inequality. A lot of people today, when they're talking about economic inequality, they're talking about differences of income. But that's not how people in the history of political thought really talked about it, or history of religious thought, for that matter, right? Jesus is not asking, with regard to the camel and the eye of the needle, like, well, how much did you earn last year, right? What is your income, right? The real question is, how wealthy are you, right? How much do you have, right? And this is a relevant question today, especially in the various kinds of economic inequality that exist today, because it's not unusual for the wealthiest people in society to claim very little in income, which allows them to pay relatively little in income taxes, right? I think Jeff Bezos, I could be wrong about this, but I think I read this, earned about $80,000 a year as CEO of Amazon, which allowed him to pay very little, relatively, in income taxes. And then he would take out loans based on his holdings, on his wealth, paying them back at low interest rates. So he could live off his wealth at a very elaborate lifestyle that would allow him, among other things, to fly to outer space without having much income. So the kind of inequality that I'm working on is wealth inequality specifically. And how did I get interested in this? I got interested from a couple different directions. One is intellectual. My previous two books were on the philosophy of 18th century Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who specifically wrote a book called The Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. It's a prominent theme in Rousseau's thought. So I've been thinking about this with regard to Rousseau for a long time. But also just living where we do, right? I mean, most people here live somewhere between Chicago and the North Shore, right? And for most people, you don't have to drive more than 5 minutes any different direction to find radically different standards of living, right? We experience this, we at least witness it every day, and it feels like sometimes increasingly so. So those two things got me interested in the question.
That's great. And as you're hearing these responses, if you have questions, we're going to be taking questions at the end of this interview. So, David, I loved the introduction of your book. It gives a really nice overview of your arguments, and I was wondering if you could read the first couple pages. That way, folks get a real sense of what's going on here.
Thanks. It's not poetry, but
we'll read it like a slam poet.
All right. Economic inequality has been steadily growing for the past few decades in the United States and in much of the developed world. According to a database maintained by the economists Thomas Blanchett, Emmanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zuckman, whereas the poorest 50% of Americans have seen their wealth grow an average of $12,000 per household since 1976, which is scarcely enough to cover a single major medical crisis without insurance, and far less than 1 year of college tuition. Those occupying the top 10% have seen their wealth grow by nearly $3 million. Those in the top 1% have seen their wealth grow by $16 million. Those in the top 0.1% have seen their wealth grow by $85 million. And those occupying the top 0.01% have seen their net wealth grow by $440 million per household. If anything, the pace of inequality's growth seems to be accelerating. According to Oxfam, over a recent 2-year period, billionaires across the globe have seen their fortunes grow more than they did in the previous 23 years combined, such that now the world's wealthiest 10 individuals have more than the poorest 40% of humanity. Elon Musk alone saw his wealth grow from 25 billion to more than 200 billion over the course of a few years. I wrote this before he bought Twitter. Per data available from the Federal Reserve, the top 1% of Americans in 2020 held more than 15 times the wealth of the bottom 50% of all Americans. The French economist, Thomas Piketty, has documented economic inequality's steady rise over the past 5 decades. After a period of lower inequality following World War II, changes in taxation, regulation, and other policies led to a significant shift of resources from the poorest citizens to the wealthiest. From the 1980s to the 2000s, almost the entire growth in household wealth belonged to the richest 20% of Americans, 2/3 of that to the top 1% alone. By 2018, economic inequality in the United States was greater than any time since the 1920s. And as even casual observers have noted, this growth in inequality has corresponded to a growth in authoritarian populist movements, social distrust, and political instability. Yet, as the historian Walter Scheidel notes, although extreme inequality may feel relatively new, it has historically been the norm. quote, inequality either grew or held fairly steady for much of recorded history, and significant reductions have been rare. Or, as the political scientist Charles Lindblom observed a generation earlier, quote, historically all societies, market or not, have preserved economic inequality. Despite this, relatively little attention has been drawn to what historical sources have been saying about inequality all along. Although it may feel to some that consciousness of inequality and its dire effects is recent in origin, the fact is that it extends back as long as philosophers have been thinking about politics. Philosophers, including the most canonical ones in the Western tradition, have expressed concerns about inequality this whole time, often right underneath our noses. While almost every undergraduate philosophy major knows about Plato's philosophy rulers, for example, few realize that he identifies economic inequality as among the greatest threats to any thriving republic. While almost everyone who has taken an introduction to political theory in college knows that Thomas Hobbes advocated for the absolute sovereignty of the Leviathan as the best path to a peaceful commonwealth, few know that for him, inequality was one of the Commonwealth's greatest threats. While almost everyone knows Adam Smith's role as an early advocate of market economies, few know that for him, inequality threatens to divide citizens everywhere it is allowed to exist. And while many know John Stuart Mill as the definitive champion of individual liberty, few know that for him, liberty needs to be balanced with a healthy degree of economic equality. We've been reading these thinkers for a long time, yet there's so much that they can still teach us about what many consider to be the defining economic, social, and political challenge of our age. Recovering their largely forgotten wisdom about inequality is the aim of this book.
Yeah, you can applaud. Yeah, that's right. Isn't that fantastic? Okay, so given that there's lots to learn from these old philosophers, I wonder, before I ask you about what some of their sort of thoughts are on it, what's an argument for reading this book and diving into what they have to say when there's so many people today who are writing about economic inequality?
Thank you. So the reason is, there are a lot of people who object to inequality today, and there's a lot of people writing about inequality today. A lot of the work on inequality today is more empirical or descriptive in its approach, right? There's a lot of social scientists are talking about how much inequality is growing, what direction it's going, and things of this nature. But there's fewer people. While people are certainly, there are a lot of people who think that inequality is a problem, there's not so many people articulating arguments why it's a problem, right? And this is one of the things that we learn from going back and reading these old books, because these old philosophers lived for arguments. This is what they did, and if we take these old books seriously, and we still teach them on college campuses pretty much everywhere still, it's worth taking their arguments seriously when they're addressing an issue that matters a lot to people today, which is namely inequality. And so by going back and mining these old books, we're forced to really think about inequality and not just reject it dogmatically, right? But understand why it might be a problem morally, politically, or socially.
So one of the reasons is because it delves into this why,
yes,
right? So some of the writers that you talk about in the book, such as Karl Marx. I mean, I think most people would say, "Oh yeah, Karl Marx had an issue with inequality," right? That's kind of a given.
Yeah.
But
spoiler.
That's right. Spoiler. That's right. Could you talk about a couple of the other folks that you write about that folks might be surprised to learn have an issue with economic inequality?
Sure. Yeah. Right. This is absolutely true. Right. It's not surprising that Marx is in a book like this, right? But some people will be more surprised by the presence of someone like the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, right? And if you remember much about Plato from your intro philosophy class some years ago, right, you may not think of Plato as an egalitarian, because here is someone who says what we need to do is take all the power in the state and give it to a small handful of philosophers, of course, who know best and can rule wisely, right? Which is not egalitarian at all, right? In political terms, and you can't argue otherwise. But what's interesting is that the question of economic inequality is decoupled from the question of political inequality, right? In someone like Plato, and not just Plato, but it's not that that economic inequality upsets democracy for Plato. The problems, according to Plato, run deeper than that. The problem with inequality would be a problem for any kind of regime because of the way it pits citizens against one another. According to Plato in the Republic, which some of you might have read at one point, he says if you have a highly unequal society in economic terms, every highly unequal city in economic terms, you don't have a single city. You have two cities. You have one of the rich and one of the poor, and they will be constantly plotting against one another, planning their revolution. And Plato wasn't speaking idly here, because in the first 20 years of his life, Athens had 3 class-based revolutions. There was an oligarchic war of the rich against the poor, followed by a democratic war of the poor against the rich, followed by an oligarchic war of the rich against the poor, right? You might remember, this all seems quaint now when Mitt Romney was running for president, but people were starting to talk about inequality, certainly when Mitt Romney was running for president in 2012. People made a big deal about Mitt Romney being a very rich man. And Mitt Romney said, who's trying to, we're trying to turn this into a class war, and there's no such thing, right? We shouldn't have this, right? But Plato would say, whenever you have rich and poor, you're going to have class war, which makes it a high priority, whether you're living in a democracy or you're even living in a republic ruled by philosopher kings.
So one of the things that you read in your introduction is that this issue of economic inequality has been around for a long time. And you just talked about Plato, who was worried about it, and he's been around for a long time. If these great thinkers have been writing about this, why do you think economic inequality has persisted?
Well, for Plato, it's easy. You didn't put the philosophers in charge. You put the philosophers in charge, we wouldn't have had any of these problems. But I think there are tendencies in human nature, right? I think, and my friend Darren McMahon, who also wrote a book about equality last year, Darren's at Dartmouth. Darren argues in his book that there are impulses in human nature that drive us both to equality and inequality, right? There are times when we feel an intense sense of injustice, when other people are getting more than us, and seem to be having a good time when we're miserable. But there's another element of human nature that makes us want to distinguish ourselves and stand above others. And it's this push and pull of these elements of human nature that sometimes push us in one direction or another. And and we find this sometimes often in cycles. This has also been in some of the research of these social scientists I mentioned earlier. Thomas Piketty, who wrote Capital in the 21st Century about a decade ago, talks about these patterns of going from equality to inequality to equality to inequality. And this can be pushed by any number of exogenous factors, right? That's because of social scientists, right? For example, there was a period of inequality in the early 20th century in the United States and many other countries, as industrial capitalism was really taking off. And then we had a couple of world wars and a Great Depression, which required, among other things, certainly jobs programs in the form of the New Deal, but also raising taxes to pay for our wars, which is what we used to do, and people assumed was an appropriate thing to do. And then, of course, starting with Ronald Reagan, we start going back the other direction. People ask, well, why are our taxes so high, right? We work harder than other people, right? So there's, these cycles of push and pull from these tendencies, I think, that are in human nature itself.
So what are some of the solutions, right, that these thinkers have come up with that you think are useful for understanding the why that the sort of quantitative descriptive research these days isn't coming up with, and that you think are important for us to know about to address this today?
Great, thanks. So I do talk about solutions as proposed by all the figures I discuss in this book. And they've all got ideas, and some of the ideas overlap, and some of them are rather distinctive, right? I think probably a lot of people would be familiar with Marx's solution, which is, you got to overthrow the bourgeoisie, right? And that's maybe the most radical solution proposed by anybody I discuss in this book. But there's a wide range of other ideas stemming from relatively modest, right? Rousseau, among other things, suggests significant luxury taxes on luxury goods, and growing to more radical solutions, perhaps. John Stuart Mill suggests an inheritance tax or an estate tax approaching about 99% on the wealthiest estates. For Mill, if you earned it, fine, but when you're done, right? And then that money goes back and it funds schools and public services for other people, for them to have their shot down the road. Maybe I can return one more time to Plato here, because Plato is the first to get here, and as is often the case, Plato often has some of the most interesting ideas of all the great philosophers. And Plato offers two sets of reflections on what to do about inequality. He says, well, if you're founding a new colony, right? If Athens is going, they're going to they're going to settle an unoccupied territory, right? He says, well, then you have the freedom to do what is probably best, which he says is to cap wealth at no more than 4 times that of the poorest people in society, right? So the richest would have no more than 4 times the wealth of the poorest. And he says that would be ideal. But he says, of course, most legislators don't have the benefit of those kind of circumstances. They're legislating for people who already live in unequal societies. So Plato suggests that in these circumstances, which are much more typical of the circumstances confronting legislators, is you've got to change the culture, right? Which is going to require educational reforms, among other things. But what this is really going to require is the agreement of some portion, forming even a committee of both rich and poor citizens. And he says it's important to include the richest ones who, according to Plato, according to him, they have a sense of fairness about these things and feel somewhat embarrassed about their extreme wealth. And if we were to look in contemporary society, we might find people like this, people kind of like Warren Buffett, right, or Abigail Disney, among others, who have said, I'm rich, and don't get me wrong, I like my money, but I also kind of feel icky about it, right? And Plato says you need to bring these people into the fold, right? And you need to get them to talk to their friends and push for educational and legal reforms that will not all at once create a much greater equality, but will incrementally but steadily create greater equality over a sustained period of time.
So I want to wrap up this part of the interview so that we can get some questions. But before we do that, I'm wondering if you could talk briefly about something very current, which is Kamala Harris talked about addressing economic inequality through a wealth tax. And I'm wondering if this idea has any basis in sort of historical, philosophical thought, if that was something that is like an old idea brought new, or anything like that. And then we can open it up.
Thank you. Yeah. So the wealth tax in recent discussion probably stems mostly from the French economist I mentioned earlier, Thomas Piketty, at the Sorbonne, and he's argued in fact for a global wealth tax, right, which would prevent everybody, all the rich people, from fleeing to the Cayman Islands, right? You got to get the Cayman Islands in on this, if you can. But a global wealth tax that would tax the largest estates at X percentage of their wealth. And I don't recall if Kamala Harris has said exactly what percentage, but I know Elizabeth Warren has talked about maybe like a 1 or 2% wealth tax in previous election cycles, and it may be something along those lines. So the answer is no, not exactly. That's a newer idea, although certainly in spirit, not dissimilar from what some of these philosophers have talked about in previous times. Certainly philosophers like Rousseau and Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill have all talked about creating greater equality through the tax system, to be sure, whether it be through estate tax, luxury tax, income tax. Adam Smith, is Sam Fleischacker still here? Yeah, he talks about a tax on carriages, right? Yes. In a vague sense, yes, but still there are original elements in this, and so there's some continuity and some new things, and in some ways, I think that extends the conversation started by the folks in this book.
All right. Well, David, thank you so much. Big round of applause for David. And now I want to open it up for some questions. So who's got a question? Yes.
All right, great. I'll start. So you said, in the introduction, that a topic this big, you had to limit yourself to the individuals you chose in the book. And I just was wondering if there was one other thinker that you really wish you could have put into this book, who would it have been and why?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, who would you have added to this illustrious list of thinkers?
Thanks, Marcel. Yeah, there's a lot of people, and I throw out some names of people. There are other figures in the Western tradition who are pretty major figures, like Aristotle. I didn't get around to. I was already at 300 pages. I certainly could have said more about Aristotle. I have a few footnotes about him. The 16th century French philosopher, actually, Jean Baudin, actually would have been really interesting to write about, because he's kind of the first person to import Plato's ideas about inequality specifically into modern Europe. But there are also opportunities to talk about non-Western sources, which would have required me to do a lot more research than I had time for. But Confucius talks about inequality, specifically as not just like helping the poor, but looking out for that gap between the rich and the poor. And then Gandhi, more recently, talks a lot about the dangers of inequality, economic inequality specifically in society. So any of those figures I would have loved to write about. And I will be writing more about some of them. I actually am just starting a paper now on Tocqueville and economic inequality, which he certainly has a lot to say about. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Who else? Yes, and then back there.
I would say, of all the thinkers in the book, the one that steps out to me as the most curious for a book on economic inequality is Adam Smith, right? So I'm wondering how the great defender of free market capitalism is somehow also a proponent of getting rid of economic inequality.
Yeah, so the question was about Adam Smith sort of playing it both ways. So how does that work?
Yeah, right. So Adam Smith his inclusion in this book will be surprising to some. But I will say, I will admit this very frankly, that I think this is actually the least original chapter in my book, because there are some terrific scholars of Adam Smith, including Sam, that I mentioned before, who have noted that Smith actually is pretty attentive to the issue of economic inequality. The remarkable thing is that this is still a very well-kept secret among academics. Yeah. Most people don't read Adam Smith, right? There are lots of business graduates, business majors, MBAs out in the world who have studied a lot of business, and they never read more than that one paragraph out of Wealth of Nations involving the butcher and the baker, right, and the invisible hand. But if you read the larger work of Wealth of Nations, which is over 1,000 pages, so it's a big book, right, and you also read his other major work, Theory of Moral Sentiments, it's pretty clear he is very concerned about economic inequality, and I'll explain why just very briefly, because it's notable and important. For Smith, one of the things that's most important and most human about us is our capacity for sympathy for others. And he talks about this in the very first paragraph of his Theory of Moral Sentiments. And a thriving community for Smith is one that involves mutual sympathy, right? Not just that I feel sympathy for you, but you feel sympathy for me. And it's easiest, of course, for us to feel sympathy who are people like us, Smith says. So if you open up a big gap between rich and poor, it becomes harder for that sympathy to cross that barrier. And it's even more peculiar than that for Smith, because it says, well, the poor people actually kind of admire the rich people, which may be true for some, right? Rousseau doesn't think that's true necessarily, but Smith does. But he says the rich people definitely don't feel sympathy for the poor, right? He has this example where he talks about this beggar, right, with sores all over him in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and the rich person wants nothing to do with him. He doesn't want to even look at him, right? This is actually, I believe, a reference to the character of Lazarus in the New Testament, in the book of Luke, which is on the cover of my book. And it's a story in which Jesus talks about how there's a rich man dining at a table with his rich friends. They have servants coming in and bringing them, fine foods. And there's this character, right? You could, if you got the book, right, you can see it there, holding out an alms dish, right? Please help me. You're having this sumptuous meal. I'm starving here. And the rich man, sometimes known as Dives in the Latin tradition, just ignores him. And then he dies, and then Jesus says quite directly, and he's going to hell because of it. So Adam Smith is referencing this biblical story, right? To make a point about sympathy in the 18th century and more modern times, which is it's a tale of inequality, right? So Adam Smith is certainly very sensitive to the complexities and problems brought on by inequality.
Gordon, you had a question.
Yeah, I've always had an awkward relationship with the extremely wealthy because I've always worked in the nonprofit sector, and when I haven't worked directly for nonprofits, I've worked for foundations that fund nonprofits, and so there's a weird stance there because typically they're just businessmen who made a ton of money. And then this was a way to not give it back to the government. And, some of them may have great hearts and whatever, but they're still they're not exactly evening the playing field or anything like that. So I was curious how foundations played at all in your thinking about this, or if any of these great thinkers had this. I mean, it's a very specific way to spend wealth, but I was curious if they had a clause for go start a foundation, and then you can just stay, you're guilt-free.
Well, that is an interesting question about sort of the idea of you have wealth, and then what do you do with your wealth? Is it really kind of selfish because it prevents you from taxes, or is it egalitarian or not egalitarian? Is it altruistic? Yeah. Right? Do any of the writers that you, or the philosophers that you write about, address that?
So I didn't talk about foundations per se in this book. There is a philosopher, a political theorist actually at Stanford University who did write a book about this. His name is Rob Reich. It's not Robert Reich, although it's spelled the same way. He goes by Rob and says, "Call me Reich." That way you don't confuse me with the other guy in the Bay Area who writes about these issues. But Rob Reich at Stanford University has written a book about this, and the title is slipping me right now. But and he's noted actually that John Stuart Mill did write about this, and I do have a chapter on Mill. But Reich's argument is that these foundations, yes, they are often set up, right, to evade taxes, for one thing. But he also says these are dangerous to democracy because it's a way of extending their own power in an unequal way. And when John Stuart Mill writes about this, he says he's especially concerned about foundations where this their particular political or social interests will extend way beyond their lifetimes. And speak to issues that are no longer pressing or relevant, right? But we still have to, we have to spend $18 million a year on saving the platypus, right? Right. But what if there's no more platypuses, right? Well, I guess we have to make a platypus museum, or right? Whereas it kind of handcuffs future generations. Where he says it's kind of a tyranny of the dead over the living in that way. And those are some of the issues that Mill explores with foundations. But yeah, the question of charity is a really interesting one overall, right? Certainly, there are very rich people who have spent a lot of money on charity, to be sure, right? And there are questions about whether that charity exercises maybe too much influence on addressing public issues, where they might be more democratically addressed.
All right, these are great questions. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering, what made you come up with
Oh yeah, where does the title come from? Because I thought the greatest of all plagues was social media. And that's not, apparently, I kept looking in the book, could not find that. So what's the deal?
Thank you, Mary. So the title, The Greatest of All Plagues, actually comes from Plato in his dialogue, The Laws. In that dialogue, he says, if you have both very rich and very poor people in society, it will lead to what he calls the greatest of all plagues, which he says ultimately are social conflict, factions, and civil war. And he says if you have extreme inequality, you will inevitably have civil war in the long run, he says. So it comes from Plato, and Plato says this is what happens when we have extreme inequality.
Love that. Any last questions before we get back to the food and the book signing? Yeah. So while you're thinking of last questions, oh, okay.
One last question.
Oh, yeah.
Just give us your 3-minute soundbite on John Stuart Mill. How does he fit in this narrative? Mr. Rights and liberty is also concerned with economic inequality.
Yeah, it's a great question because most people, when they read John Stuart Mill, read either one of his two most famous books, Utilitarianism or On Liberty, published in 1861 and 1859, respectively. And Mill is famous in On Liberty for being a defender of individual rights and individualism, the right to be left alone, right? Which sounds like maybe someone who's not an economic egalitarian. Right? I mean, leave me alone, keep your hands off my wallet. Those things sound like they go together, right? But interestingly, Mill says they don't, in fact, because there are other things that matter to Mill as much as freedom or individuality. And that is a sense of community, interestingly, which is a theme that often goes unnoticed in John Stuart Mill. But it's actually pretty persistent through a lot of his famous works. It's a lot in utilitarianism, but mostly in the one work of his that nobody reads anymore, his Principles of Political Economy, which is this 1,000-page treatise on the relationship of economics and politics, right? In fact, just as an aside, I think an ulterior motive of me writing this book is to get people to read the long, boring works of the great philosophers, like Wealth of Nations, Das Kapital, Principles of Political Economy, the Bible, but in the Principles of Political Economy, Mill is very explicit. He says we can't develop a sense of community if we have both extreme wealth and extreme poverty simultaneously. He talks about this in the workplace, how in Victorian England, how the workers hate their employees, the workers hate their employers, the employers despise their workers. The employer is always afraid that the workers are going to steal from them. The workers are always talking about how much they hate their boss. And he says, look, this is not going to be resolved until we bring some greater degree of equality to society. And he offers a number of measures. One I mentioned earlier, which is having a fairly steep estate or inheritance tax. But he has a lot of other really original ideas, including worker cooperatives, right? Where workers own their businesses, right? He says if workers own their businesses, they're going to share a lot better, right? The proceeds of their businesses, right? But he's got a whole, I probably talk about 10 different measures that he employs to try to bring about greater equality. And Mill's a good example of somebody in this book that people don't often think of as being egalitarian, but is actually pretty profoundly egalitarian.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'm not a scholar of contemporary comparative politics, so I don't want to speak out of school too much. But it is true, right, that the Scandinavian countries tend to have a higher degree of equality. I don't know enough to tell you exactly why they do, other than that they do embrace policies. I mean, they certainly do have a higher income taxes, for one thing, and they do tend to have, maybe more than places like the United States, this kind of sense of community or mutual sympathy, right? To use the language of Mill and Smith, respectively, where they feel maybe some sense of obligation to one another, where these policies are better received.
All right. So is there anything that you want to say as we wrap up?
Yeah. So I do want to, again, thank everybody for coming out tonight. It's been a great pleasure thus far to visit with all of you. We're going to stick around a while longer, but first and foremost, before we do anything else, today is my wife Jen's birthday. And so if we could lead a little sing-along here, Jen can come tend to this. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Jen. Happy birthday to you.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.